In a small, quiet town nestled between rolling hills and vast fields of golden wheat, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The townsfolk were simple people, farmers, shopkeepers, teachers, and laborers, who lived their lives with little fuss or drama. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's names, where gossip spread faster than wildfire, and where nothing much ever happened to shake the monotony of daily routines. That is, until the day John Miller walked into the local courthouse. John was a farmer in his late 40s, with sun-weathered skin, calloused hands, and a face lined by years of hard work under the blazing sun. He wasn't a man who drew attention to himself. In fact, most people thought of him as just another ordinary guy who spent his days tending to crops and animals on his modest farm. His clothes were always dusty, his boots caked with mud, and his truck rattled like it might fall apart any second. To the townsfolk, John was the epitome of simplicity, a man who didn't seem to have much going on upstairs. The case that brought John to court revolved around something seemingly trivial, but deeply important to the community: water. For months, the region had been suffering from one of the worst droughts anyone could remember. Rivers ran dry, wells emptied, and crops withered under the relentless heat. Desperate to save his fields, John had taken matters into his own hands. Using an old irrigation system he'd patched together from scraps, he diverted water from a nearby stream onto his land. While this act kept his crops alive, it also angered some of his neighbors, who claimed he was stealing water that belonged to everyone. Word of the dispute reached Judge Harrison, a stern and no-nonsense man in his 60s who presided over the local court. Known for his sharp tongue and dismissive attitude, Judge Harrison rarely minced words when dealing with cases involving rural disputes. To him, farmers were often stubborn and uneducated, unwilling to follow rules they didn't understand. So when John appeared before him, dressed in his worn-out jeans and faded flannel shirt, the judge immediately formed an opinion about the man standing nervously in front of him. "Mr. Miller," Judge Harrison began, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "do you even know why you're here today?" John shifted uncomfortably, adjusting the brim of his hat as he replied, "Yes, Your Honor, I'm accused of taking water without permission." "And do you admit to doing so?" the judge pressed, leaning forward slightly in his chair. "Yes, sir, but if I may explain—" "Explain what exactly?" Judge Harrison interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "That you decided the law doesn't apply to you because you think your corn is more important than everyone else's? Or perhaps you believe rivers are public property, free for anyone to use however they please?" The courtroom, filled with curious onlookers, erupted in murmurs. Some nodded in agreement with the judge, while others exchanged sympathetic glances toward John. The tension in the air was palpable, but John remained calm, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor," he said finally, his voice steady despite the hostile tone of the questioning, "I didn't take that water lightly. My family depends on those crops, and without them we'd lose everything. I did what I thought was necessary to survive." Judge Harrison let out a derisive chuckle. "Survive? Mr. Miller, this isn't some Wild West movie where you can justify breaking the law because you're hungry. We live in a civilized society, governed by rules designed to protect everyone, not just individual interests." At this point, the judge leaned back in his chair, his gaze sweeping over the room. "Let me ask you something," he continued, his tone mocking. "Do you even know what jurisdiction means, or how about due process? Have you ever heard of these terms, or am I wasting my time trying to reason with someone who probably thinks the Constitution is some kind of farming manual?" The audience erupted in laughter, though not everyone found the comment amusing. A few people shifted awkwardly in their seats, uncomfortable with the judge's blatant disrespect. John, however, didn't flinch. He simply stood there, his eyes fixed on the judge, betraying no emotion. What Judge Harrison and everyone else in the room didn't realize was that beneath John's humble exterior lay a mind sharper than anyone could imagine. Years ago, long before he became a farmer, John had been one of the brightest students at Harvard Law School. He'd graduated at the top of his class, earning accolades for his groundbreaking research on environmental law and property rights. Professors praised him as a prodigy, Peers admired him for his intellect, and recruiters clamored to hire him at prestigious firms. But success came with a price. As John climbed the ranks of the legal world, he grew disillusioned by the greed, corruption, and endless games of power he witnessed. Lawsuits dragged on for years, benefiting only the wealthy elite while ordinary people suffered. Policies meant to protect communities were twisted to serve corporate interests. And justice, which should have been blind, seemed to favor those with deep pockets and influential connections. Disgusted by what he saw, John made a drastic decision. He left the legal profession behind, trading suits and briefcases for overalls and tractors. He bought a small plot of land far away from the chaos of cities, determined to live a simpler, more honest life. Over time, he built a thriving farm, raised a family, and found peace in the rhythms of nature. Yet even as he embraced this new chapter, he never forgot the lessons he'd learned in law school. If anything, his experiences had sharpened his understanding of the law, making him more aware of its flaws and its potential to create real change. Now, standing in that courtroom, facing a judge who underestimated him at every turn, John felt a familiar spark ignite within him. He hadn't planned to reveal his past, nor did he want to prove anything to anyone. But as Judge Harrison continued to belittle him, dismissing his intelligence and mocking his efforts to defend himself, John realized he couldn't stay silent anymore. This wasn't just about saving his farm or clearing his name. It was about standing up for truth, fairness, and the principles he'd once dedicated his life to protecting. And as the trial progressed, John prepared to show the world, and Judge Harrison, that sometimes brilliance hides where no one expects to find it. Little did the judge know he was about to learn a lesson he would never forget. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the prosecution took center stage. Representing the town's water authority, a slick young lawyer named Mr. Peterson stepped forward, confident in his ability to crush John Miller's case. With perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit that screamed success, Peterson exuded arrogance. He glanced at John briefly, smirking as if already certain of victory. To him, this was nothing more than a formality, a chance to demonstrate his legal prowess against someone he assumed had no idea what they were doing. Peterson began his opening statement with practiced eloquence. "Your Honor," he said, addressing Judge Harrison, "the defendant, Mr. John Miller, knowingly violated established regulations governing water usage during a time of severe scarcity. By diverting water from a shared resource without proper authorization, he not only broke the law but also jeopardized the livelihoods of countless others who depend on that same stream for survival." He paused dramatically, letting his words sink in before continuing. "We will prove beyond any doubt that Mr. Miller acted recklessly and selfishly, prioritizing his own interests over the collective good. Furthermore, we will show that his actions constitute a clear violation of Section 47B of the Water Management Act, which carries significant penalties." As Peterson spoke, he used technical terms like jurisdictional boundaries, statutory compliance, and environmental impact assessments to overwhelm both the judge and the audience. His strategy was obvious: confuse everyone into submission. After all, how could someone like John, an uneducated farmer, possibly counter such complex arguments? When it came time for John to respond, the tension in the room was palpable. Everyone expected him to stumble, perhaps even admit defeat. Instead, John surprised everyone by rising calmly to his feet. Without hesitation, he removed his hat, placed it on the table beside him, and looked directly at Judge Harrison. "Your Honor," John began, his voice steady and clear, "I understand the seriousness of the charges against me, and I respect the court's responsibility to enforce the law. However, I must point out several critical flaws in the prosecution's argument." There was a collective gasp in the courtroom. Even Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, intrigued by the sudden shift in tone. Gone was the nervous farmer who had fidgeted earlier. In his place stood a man radiating quiet confidence. John continued, undeterred by the murmurs around him. "First, let's address the claim that I acted recklessly. Far from being reckless, my actions were calculated and deliberate. Before implementing the irrigation system, I conducted extensive research into local hydrology and consulted scientific studies about sustainable water management practices. I ensured that the amount of water I diverted would replenish naturally, within weeks causing minimal disruption to the ecosystem. He paused, pulling a thick binder from beneath the table. Inside were neatly organized documents, maps, charts, weather reports, and environmental data, all meticulously compiled to support his claims. Flipping through the pages, John highlighted specific sections as he spoke. For example, he said, pointing to a map, "This shows the flow patterns of the stream throughout the year. As you can see, the section I accessed experiences seasonal overflow, meaning excess water would have gone to waste anyway. By redirecting a small portion of that surplus, I actually helped maintain ecological balance while saving my crops." The room fell silent as John pressed on. "Second, regarding the accusation that I ignored regulatory requirements, I'd like to clarify something. While I did not seek formal approval from the Water Authority, I adhered to all relevant guidelines outlined in Section 47B of the Water Management Act. Specifically, subsection C states that temporary diversions are permissible under emergency conditions, provided they do not harm downstream users or ecosystems. Given the unprecedented drought, I believed, and still believe, that my situation qualified as an emergency." By now, Peterson was visibly agitated. He hadn't anticipated such a detailed rebuttal, let alone one backed by hard evidence. But John wasn't finished yet. "Finally," he concluded, turning toward the judge, "let's talk about fairness. If the prosecution truly cared about protecting shared resources, they would focus their efforts on holding large corporations accountable for their excessive water consumption. Yet here we are, prosecuting a small-time farmer instead of addressing the real culprits. Doesn't that strike anyone else as hypocritical?" The courtroom erupted into murmurs once again. Some spectators nodded approvingly, impressed by John's logic and passion. Others whispered among themselves, speculating about where this mysterious knowledge had come from. Even Judge Harrison seemed taken aback, though he tried to hide it behind a mask of impartiality. Peterson, desperate to regain control, attempted to challenge John's assertions. "Your Honor," he interjected, "the defendant is cherry-picking facts to suit his narrative. He cannot simply redefine laws to justify breaking them. Moreover, his so-called research lacks credibility and should not be considered valid evidence." John smiled faintly, almost pityingly. "With all due respect, Mr. Peterson," he replied, "you're misrepresenting my position. I'm not redefining anything. I'm interpreting the law as written. And as for the validity of my research, I'd be happy to provide expert testimony from hydrologists and ecologists who reviewed my findings. Would you care to cross-examine them?" The question hung in the air, leaving Peterson flustered. For a moment he stared at John, searching for a weakness to exploit. Finding none, he reluctantly sat down, defeated for the moment. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Miller," he said slowly, "where exactly did you acquire this expertise? It's quite impressive, to say the least." John hesitated, unsure whether to reveal his past. Finally, he decided honesty was the best policy. "Your Honor," he admitted, "I studied law many years ago. Though I left the profession, I never stopped learning. When faced with challenges like this, I rely on the principles I once dedicated my life to upholding." A murmur rippled through the crowd. People exchanged astonished looks, piecing together the puzzle. Was it possible that the humble farmer standing before them was actually a former legal prodigy? The thought sent shockwaves through the room, forcing everyone, including Judge Harrison, to reconsider their assumptions. As the session drew to a close, it was clear that the trial had taken an unexpected turn. What had started as a routine hearing had transformed into something extraordinary, a battle of wits between a seasoned prosecutor and a self-taught genius hiding in plain sight. And though the outcome remained uncertain, one thing was undeniable. John Miller was no ordinary defendant. For the first time, Judge Harrison felt a flicker of doubt. Had he misjudged this man? Could there be more to John Miller than met the eye? These questions lingered in his mind as the court adjourned, setting the stage for what promised to be a dramatic confrontation in the days ahead. The courtroom was abuzz with whispers as the trial resumed the following morning. Word of John Miller's unexpected brilliance had spread like wildfire overnight, and the once sleepy courthouse was now packed to capacity. Farmers, townsfolk, reporters, and even a few curious lawyers from neighboring counties filled every available seat. Everyone wanted to see how this unusual case would unfold, and whether the unassuming farmer could maintain his astonishing defense. Judge Harrison entered the room with his usual air of authority, but those who knew him well noticed something different in his demeanor. His steps were slower, his expression more contemplative. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain, not just about the case itself, but about his own judgment. The man standing before him wasn't the simpleton he'd assumed. Instead, John Miller seemed to possess a level of legal acumen that rivaled seasoned attorneys. This realization gnawed at the judge, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about his biases and assumptions. As the session began, Mr. Peterson, the prosecution lawyer, launched another attempt to regain control. Determined to discredit John's arguments, he focused on nitpicking minor details and questioning the reliability of John's evidence. "Your Honor," Peterson said, his voice sharp and insistent, "the defendant has presented a great deal of data, but none of it comes from officially recognized sources. How can we trust information gathered by someone without proper credentials?" John didn't flinch. Calmly, he rose to address the court again. "Mr. Peterson raises a valid point," he acknowledged, nodding slightly. "However, I'd like to remind everyone that science doesn't care about credentials. It cares about accuracy. The studies I referenced were conducted by reputable institutions and published in peer-reviewed journals. If my opponent doubts their validity, I invite him to review them himself." Petson faltered, caught off guard by John's composure. He glanced toward Judge Harrison, hoping for support, but found only silence. The judge sat motionless, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, watching intently as the exchange unfolded. It was clear he was struggling to reconcile his initial impression of John with the reality unfolding before him. To make matters worse for Peterson, John pressed his advantage further. "In addition to the scientific evidence," he continued, pulling out another document from his binder, "I'd like to introduce testimony from local farmers who depend on the same stream. They've confirmed that my irrigation system caused no harm. In fact, some have benefited indirectly from improved water flow patterns." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder as John handed over signed affidavits to the bailiff, who passed them to the judge. Each statement corroborated John's claims, painting a picture of a man who had acted responsibly rather than recklessly. Even Judge Harrison couldn't ignore the weight of such overwhelming support. As the day wore on, Peterson became increasingly desperate. He tried shifting tactics, accusing John of manipulating facts and exaggerating his contributions to the community. But each accusation fell flat when met with John's calm, factual responses. By the end of the session, it was painfully obvious that the prosecution was losing ground, badly. Meanwhile, Judge Harrison wrestled with his growing unease. On one hand, he prided himself on upholding justice impartially, free from personal bias. Yet, here he was, forced to admit that his preconceived notions about John had clouded his judgment. He recalled his earlier mockery of the farmer's intelligence and cringed inwardly. What kind of judge mocked a defendant based on appearances? Alone? Worse still, what message did that send to the public? That evening, unable to shake off his discomfort, Judge Harrison retreated to his chambers. Surrounded by stacks of law books and files, he poured himself a cup of coffee and tried to focus on the case. But his thoughts kept drifting back to John Miller. Who was this man, really? How had someone with such extraordinary talent chosen to live such a humble life? And most importantly, how could he, as a judge, ensure fairness moving forward without undermining the integrity of the court? After hours of reflection, Harrison arrived at a difficult decision. He realized there was only one way to salvage the situation: humility. The next day, he would need to acknowledge his mistake, not just to John, but to everyone present in the courtroom. It wouldn't be easy. Admitting fault went against everything he believed about maintaining authority. But deep down, he knew it was the right thing to do. The next morning, the courtroom was even more crowded than the day before. Anticipation crackled in the air as Judge Harrison took his seat. After calling the session to order, he cleared his throat and addressed the room. "Before we proceed," he began, his tone unusually subdued, "I feel compelled to say something. Yesterday, during the course of this trial, I made certain remarks about the defendant's understanding of the law. Those comments were inappropriate and unfounded. Upon reviewing the evidence presented thus far, I must concede that Mr. Miller has demonstrated an impressive grasp of legal principles, far beyond what I initially presumed." A hush fell over the audience. No one dared breathe as the judge paused, visibly gathering his thoughts. Then, looking directly at John, he added, "For that, I apologize. It is my duty to ensure that justice prevails regardless of personal biases or assumptions. Moving forward, I will strive to uphold that principle with greater diligence." The room erupted into applause, though quickly silenced by the judge's stern gaze. For John, the apology carried significant weight. Though he hadn't sought recognition or validation, hearing the judge acknowledge his capabilities meant something. It validated not just his efforts, but also the broader message he hoped to convey: that intelligence and wisdom aren't confined to prestigious degrees or fancy suits. With the atmosphere transformed, the remainder of the trial proceeded with renewed seriousness. Peterson, humbled by the turn of events, struggled to mount a coherent counter-argument. Every time he attempted to challenge John's points, he found himself outmaneuvered. Whether discussing constitutional rights, environmental ethics, or procedural fairness, John remained steps ahead, dismantling the prosecution's case piece by piece. By the end of the session, it was evident to everyone, including Judge Harrison, that the verdict would favor John. Yet, the trial had become about much more than water rights or legal technicalities. It had evolved into a powerful lesson about perception versus reality, reminding everyone present that brilliance often hides where least expected. As the court adjourned for the day, John returned to his seat, his expression unreadable. Despite the mounting admiration directed his way, he remained grounded, focusing solely on the truth he sought to protect. Little did he know, however, that his actions had already sparked conversations far beyond the confines of the courtroom. Reporters scribbled notes furiously, eager to uncover more about the enigmatic farmer-turned-legal genius. Speculation swirled about his past, his motivations, and what might come next. For Judge Harrison, the experience was equally transformative. Having confronted his own biases, he vowed to approach future cases with greater openness and humility. Though the road ahead promised challenges, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to ensuring that justice served not only the letter of the law, but its spirit as well. As the sun set over the small town, casting long shadows across the fields, life seemed poised to change for John, for the judge, and perhaps for everyone touched by this remarkable story. The final day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. The atmosphere was electric, as if everyone in attendance knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Reporters huddled near the front rows, notebooks ready, while townsfolk craned their necks to catch a glimpse of John Miller. Even Judge Harrison seemed unusually alert, his usual stern demeanor softened by the weight of his earlier apology. It was clear that this case had transcended its original purpose. It was no longer just about water rights or legal arguments. It had become a story of redemption, respect, and the power of truth. When the session began, Mr. Peterson made one last-ditch effort to salvage the prosecution's case. Standing tall despite his growing frustration, he addressed the court with forced confidence. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady but lacking its earlier arrogance, "while the defendant has presented an impressive array of evidence, we must remember that laws exist for a reason. They are designed to protect the collective good, not justify individual actions based on personal interpretation." He turned to face John, his tone shifting slightly. "Mr. Miller may have acted with good intentions, but good intentions alone do not absolve someone of breaking the law. If every person decided to bend regulations to suit their needs, chaos would ensue. John listened patiently, nodding occasionally as if acknowledging the validity of Peterson's concerns. When it was his turn to speak, he rose calmly, his presence commanding without being overbearing. "Mr. Peterson raises a fair point," John admitted, surprising everyone in the room. "Laws are indeed meant to serve the greater good, and I respect that principle deeply. However, laws are also tools created by humans, which means they aren't perfect. Sometimes circumstances arise that require us to think beyond black and white interpretations." He paused, scanning the faces of those gathered before, continuing. "This drought isn't just a crisis, it's a wake-up call. We can't keep relying on outdated policies or ignoring the realities of climate change. My actions weren't about defying the law, they were about finding a solution within its framework. And if the system failed me, then maybe it's time to ask why." His words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement. Farmers exchanged knowing glances, remembering their own struggles during the drought. Even Judge Harrison leaned forward, visibly moved by John's impassioned plea. For the first time, the judge saw the bigger picture, not just the specifics of this case, but the broader implications for communities grappling with environmental challenges. Peterson, sensing defeat, tried one final gambit. "Even if all that is true," he countered, "the defendant still broke the rules. Shouldn't there be consequences for such behavior?" John smiled faintly, his expression neither triumphant nor bitter. "Consequences are important," he agreed, "but so is context. If punishing me discourages others from taking responsible risks to solve problems, then what message does that send? Instead of focusing solely on penalties, shouldn't we encourage innovation and adaptability? After all, survival often depends on thinking outside the box." The courtroom erupted into murmurs again, some people whispering their approval, others shaking their heads in disbelief at how thoroughly John had dismantled the prosecution's case. Peterson sat down, defeated, unable to offer any further rebuttals. The battle was over, and it was clear who had won. Judge Harrison took a deep breath before delivering his verdict. Removing his glasses, he looked directly at John, his voice firm yet tinged with admiration. "Mr. Miller," he began, "after careful consideration of the evidence presented, and after reflecting on the arguments made throughout this trial, I find in your favor. You acted responsibly and ethically under difficult circumstances, adhering to the spirit of the law even when procedural requirements fell short." The room erupted into applause, though Judge Harrison quickly silenced it with a raised hand. "That said," he added, "this ruling should not be seen as encouragement to disregard regulations. Rather, it highlights the need for reform, a reminder that our systems must evolve to meet the challenges of today's world." As the gavel struck, officially closing the case, John stood quietly, his expression unchanged. There was no victory lap, no grand speech. He simply thanked the judge and left the courtroom, disappearing into the crowd outside. But the impact of his defense lingered long after he was gone. Later that afternoon, Judge Harrison found himself sitting alone in his chambers, staring at the empty chair where John had stood. The farmer's words echoed in his mind. If every person decided to bend regulations to suit their needs. Yet, wasn't that exactly what justice required? Sometimes flexibility, compassion, understanding. Harrison sighed, realizing how much he had learned from this experience. His initial dismissal of John had stemmed from arrogance, an unwillingness to see beyond stereotypes. But now, humbled by the events of the trial, he resolved to approach future cases differently. No longer would he allow preconceived notions to cloud his judgment. Justice demanded better than that. Determined to make amends, Harrison reached out to John privately later that week. Their meeting took place in a quiet corner of the courthouse cafeteria, far from prying eyes. Harrison extended his hand, which John shook firmly. "Mr. Miller," the judge began, his tone sincere, "I owe you an apology, not just for my remarks during the trial, but for underestimating you entirely. What you did, it reminded me of why I became a judge in the first place." John chuckled softly, his weathered face breaking into a rare smile. "Apology accepted, Your Honor. Truth is, I didn't come here looking for recognition or revenge. I just wanted folks to understand that sometimes doing the right thing means bending the rules a little." Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "Well, consider this lesson learned. From now on, I'll strive to listen more and assume less. Maybe together, we can push for changes that help farmers like you navigate these kinds of situations without fear of punishment." Their conversation continued for nearly an hour, covering topics ranging from agricultural policy to judicial ethics. By the end, both men felt a newfound respect for each other, one born not of shared backgrounds, but of mutual understanding. News of the trial spread rapidly, capturing national attention. Articles appeared in newspapers praising John's ingenuity and calling for reforms in water management laws. Television crews descended upon the small town, eager to interview the man behind the headlines. Yet John remained elusive, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. When reporters finally tracked him down at his farm, they found him tending to his crops as if nothing had changed. "I'm just a farmer," he told them, brushing dirt off his hands. "All I want is to grow food, take care of my family, and leave this place better than I found it. If my story helps others realize that brilliance comes in all forms, then maybe it was worth it." Though John avoided the spotlight, his influence rippled outward. Inspired by his courage, local farmers formed coalitions to advocate for sustainable practices and fairer policies. Lawmakers began drafting legislation aimed at addressing the unique challenges faced by rural communities. And Judge Harrison, inspired by the trial, started mentoring young lawyers, teaching them the importance of empathy and humility in the pursuit of justice. Years later, the tale of John Miller and the courtroom showdown became legend, a testament to the power of resilience, intellect, and integrity. People spoke of him not as a farmer-turned-legal genius, but as a symbol of hope, proof that greatness could emerge from the most unexpected places. And through it all, John remained steadfast, content to live a quiet life among his fields and animals. To him, the real reward wasn't fame or fortune, it was knowing he'd made a difference. In the weeks that followed the trial, life in the small town slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The fields began to recover from the drought, thanks to the first rains of the season. Farmers worked tirelessly, their spirits lifted by the knowledge that they had survived one of the toughest periods in recent memory. Yet amidst the return to normalcy, whispers of John Miller's courtroom triumph continued to circulate. His name became synonymous with resilience, ingenuity, and quiet dignity, a reminder that brilliance often hides where no one expects it. For John, however, little changed in his daily routine. He woke up before dawn, tended to his crops, fed his livestock, and spent evenings sitting on his porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. To anyone passing by, he seemed like the same unassuming farmer they'd always known. But those who had witnessed his transformation in the courtroom knew better. They saw him not just as a man who grew corn and wheat, but as someone who had stood up for truth and fairness when it mattered most. The media frenzy eventually died down, though the occasional reporter still knocked on John's door, hoping for an exclusive interview or photo opportunity. Each time, John politely declined, explaining that he preferred to let his actions speak louder than words. "I didn't go to court to become famous," he told one persistent journalist. "I went there because I believed I was right. That's all there is to it." Despite his reluctance to embrace the spotlight, John's influence extended far, beyond the confines of the courtroom. Inspired by his story, local farmers banded together to form a coalition aimed at addressing water management issues and advocating for sustainable practices. They named it the Miller Initiative, a nod to the man who had sparked their collective awakening. Meetings were held in community centers, barns, and even John's own kitchen, where discussions ranged from crop rotation techniques to lobbying for policy changes at the state level. One of the key figures in this movement was Sarah Collins, a young environmental scientist who had attended the trial out of curiosity and left profoundly moved. She approached John shortly afterward, offering her expertise to help amplify the farmers' voices. Together, they drafted proposals outlining innovative solutions to combat drought and promote ecological balance. These documents caught the attention of lawmakers, leading to several groundbreaking reforms, including the introduction of emergency provisions for small-scale farmers during natural disasters. Judge Harrison also played a pivotal role in shaping the aftermath of the trial. Haunted by his initial misjudgment of John, he embarked on a personal mission to ensure such mistakes wouldn't happen again. He began attending agricultural conferences, listening intently to farmers' concerns, and incorporating their feedback into his rulings. He also implemented training programs for junior judges, emphasizing the importance of empathy, open-mindedness, and humility in the pursuit of justice. "Every person who steps into my courtroom deserves respect," Harrison told a group of law students during a seminar. "You never know what kind of wisdom might be hiding beneath appearances. If I hadn't learned that lesson from Mr. Miller, I might have gone on making unfair assumptions, and that would have been a disservice to everyone involved." Meanwhile, John's story inspired countless others outside the farming community. Teachers used it as a case study in classrooms, highlighting the importance of critical thinking and perseverance. Lawyers cited it in debates about judicial reform, arguing that the legal system should prioritize substance over superficial judgments. Even artists found inspiration in his journey, creating paintings, songs, and poems celebrating the quiet heroism of ordinary people. Yet, despite the widespread admiration, John remained humble. When asked about his newfound status as a local legend, he simply shrugged. "I'm no different today than I was yesterday," he said. "If anything, I hope folks remember that intelligence isn't about fancy degrees or big words. It's about using what you know to make things better for yourself and for others." As years passed, the memory of the trial faded for some, but for many it became part of the town's identity. Parents told their children stories about the farmer who outsmarted a slick lawyer and earned the respect of a skeptical judge. School children wrote essays imagining what it must have been like to sit in that crowded courtroom, witnessing history unfold. And every year, on the anniversary of the verdict, townsfolk gathered at the courthouse to honor John's legacy, not with grand speeches or ceremonies, but with shared meals, laughter, and gratitude. John himself rarely attended these gatherings, preferring to stay in the background. But one year he made an exception. Standing at the edge of the crowd, he listened quietly as Sarah Collins addressed the assembly. "Today," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "we celebrate more than just a victory in court. We celebrate a man who reminded us of our shared humanity, a man who showed us that courage and compassion can change the world." When the applause subsided, Sarah turned to John and gestured for him to join her. Reluctantly, he stepped forward, his hat clutched tightly in his hands. For a moment, he stood silently, scanning the sea of familiar faces. Then, with a faint smile, he spoke. "I didn't do this alone," he said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "Every one of you played a part. Whether it was supporting me during the trial, working alongside me in the fields, or fighting for change afterward. This isn't my story. It's ours. And if we keep standing together, there's nothing we can't achieve." The crowd erupted into cheers, tears streaming down cheeks as people hugged each other tightly. In that moment, it was clear that John's impact stretched far beyond the courtroom. He had ignited a spark, a belief in the power of unity, resilience, and integrity that would continue to burn brightly for generations to come. Years later, when John finally retired from farming, he donated his land to the community, transforming it into a cooperative farm run by local families. A plaque was erected near the entrance, inscribed with a simple message, dedicated to John Miller, whose courage and wisdom taught us that greatness lies not in titles or accolades, but in the quiet acts of kindness and justice that shape our world. Though John eventually passed away, his legacy endured. His story was told and retold, inspiring new waves of activists, innovators, and dreamers. And whenever someone doubted their ability to make a difference, they remembered the farmer who stood firm against adversity, proving that brilliance isn't confined to boardrooms or lecture halls. It thrives wherever honesty and determination reside. In the end, John Miller wasn't just a man, he was a symbol of hope, a testament to the idea that even the smallest voices can echo across the ages, reminding us that true greatness comes from within.